And I said, can you please tell me, like, there must be these autobiographies by white men about their black wives, their mixed families. There must be those in history. So it appears that for whatever reason, in the 57, 58 years since Loving and back into American history, it appears that white men have not written these books, even though everybody else is now talking about these interracial families. And
Yeah.
one question I would ask you, I got a couple of responses, interesting suggestions when I asked this as an open question. Why is that? Why do you think that is? I don't know, a couple of different possibilities. Why would you think, if you knew that?
I
Why are
think
they not?
that, I mean, if we're talking about today in 2025, I think that people, uh, when it comes to racial issues, something that I've experienced is like, it's not, which is crazy because of your situation, but like, it's not your story to tell. Like you can't
Right.
talk about because you're in the power position. It goes back to those like, those power,
That
the oppressor
intersectional,
versus
yeah.
oppressed stuff. You're in the power position. So you shouldn't be telling the story because you're going to tell it from the perspective of something in power. I have to assume that there's some element of that. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, educator in Los Angeles now, just bringing viewpoint diversity to the mainstream and all kinds of culture war issues, particularly in education, but really everywhere, and just having the difficult conversations that I think we need to have as a society. So I touch on these third rail topics: race and gender and COVID and all these things that you're not supposed to talk about. And my guest today is Dr. Adam Gussow, who is an English professor at Ole Miss, at University of Mississippi, and he's also an author, and he's written a couple of books. And his latest one is My Family and I, a Mississippi Memoir, and it's a lot about interracial marriage and how we've kind of lost the plot in some ways when it comes to the issues around race. And I'm really excited. We have a lot of common friends and acquaintances in this world of talking about these topics. And I'm in California and he's in Mississippi, and those are two different worlds within America. But I think there's a lot that we can kind of pull apart about how do we move forward in the 21st century for our future generations when it comes to race relations in America. So, Dr. Gussow, it's great to have you here. I'm really excited to hear about your book, and also just get your thoughts on everything when it comes to race and how we approach it and where we should go when it comes to those issues moving
Mm.
forward for the country.
Well, one of the interesting things is, when I describe my book, I call it a memoir with boosts, like it's one of those Bolthead, Boathouse Farms kind of green juices with actual juice, and then there's all the other stuff that's in it. When you're talking about a memoir, you're talking about somebody who's decided, I'm a guy with a lot of ideological stuff bouncing around, but I'm also a guy who wants to tell a story about a love relationship. And so if I were to talk about my attitude towards race, it begins in a funny way. There's a story I tell in the book, but it begins with the fact it's a book about love. And at the present moment in America right now, we can argue about that, but it feels to me like there's not a whole lot of love swirling around. And so for somebody who's looking for that, it's there. And it's about an interracial love, an interracial marriage. It's about the raising of the son here in Mississippi that my wife and I decided very much that we wanted to have. We're a midlife couple. We're actually a Match.com success story. She was my first Match.com date. So if you're talking about, but I have to go back. I have to tell just a little story because, again, with a memoir, what you're talking about is letting the life that's actually been lived speak for itself in some way, even as you filter ideologies in. And so I'm going to get to this. It's about an interracial love story, and it's about a biracial son who's born in 2006. So what it's inevitably is, what's it like for, number one, to do that in Mississippi, contemporary Mississippi, which forces you to think about historical Mississippi and how race worked there and how interracial love was problematic there. But it's also about the American sort of cultural political landscape from 2008, when Barack Obama was elected and ushered in a quote sort of post-racial America? What did it feel like to be a couple with a 2-year-old like us, right? You could hold your kid up in front of the TV on election night, Grant Park, there's Jesse Jackson sobbing, tears coming down, a multiracial crowd. What does it feel like to go from that to all of the public shootings, Gabby Giffords and then Adam Lanza at Newtown Elementary School, and you've got a kid, right? So I'm thinking about guns. That's inevitably an element of it. But in terms of race, obviously, then the sort of two huge events that impacted us, or at least certainly impacted me as the father of a black/biracial son, were Trayvon Martin in 2012, the trial in 2013, the formation of Black Lives Matter, and then in 2014, Michael Brown. I'm a guy who was, I mean, I take the story all the way back, actually, to the racial melodrama that happened at Duke, the so-called Duke lacrosse rape case, in which a black female stripper was supposedly raped and savaged by these prep school guys, lacrosse players, right? Fraternity guys. And of course, when that happened back in whenever it was, 2005, I'm forgetting, 2005, six, I inevitably initially took, I mean, I was interracially married at that point, and I'm thinking like the side of the black woman who was making the accusations. It turned out she was lying. Just within the past 6 months, she finally acknowledged that she was lying. But there's been some really good post-mortem kind of stuff on this. And I think realizing as the case fell apart, that my chain had been jerked, made me think about racial melodrama as a way that America functions. There's an amazing book and I'm giving you a long-winded answer, an amazing book by a film critic out of LA in California. I think she's at UCLA. And it was a book about sort of racial melodramas from Uncle Tom to OJ. She has this idea that there's a sort of dramatic form that America loves to use to think about race at its most extreme. It's Uncle Tom being beaten down, being beaten to death, black innocents being savaged by, well, there were actually two slaves who beat him down, but Simon Legree, the prototypical slave master. And she says basically that's the racial formation that helped us think through OJ, not think through, help us feel through and cause sort of huge disruptions. I took it forward to thinking about what happened to George Floyd in the summer of 2020. And I realized, my God, the eruption that happened there was also a kind of racial melodrama. It doesn't mean that a man who shouldn't have been strangled to death wasn't strangled to death. We can argue about that. And I don't in my book. I just frame it as a thing that created a huge disruption. But what we have to acknowledge is that sometimes that there is a kind of spectacle. Trayvon Martin was that sort of spectacle. Michael Brown was that sort of spectacle. And one thing my book tries to do, and I'll pause now, let you get in a second question, is think through those things. So one thing my book offers, among many other things, is what I'd call a kind of deep centrist dive into what actually happened between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. Let's imagine you're not a lawyer. Let's imagine you're just somebody intensely interested in understanding so that you can properly advise your son, right? Barack Obama said, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. Well, I had a son, I have a black son, right? And Michael Brown, the same thing. Like, I have to understand, are they truly in danger? Is my son truly in danger, or is that fear that's being evoked maybe not quite the right response? So we have to understand. And we can talk about how I finally arbitrated those things. But long-winded answer to say that the moment you live the kind of relationship that I'm living in Mississippi or anywhere in America, and the moment you go through those years, if you're a person who kind of teaches African-American lit, as I do sometimes, blues scholar, you're forced to kind of wrestle with contemporary American history and the race stuff that's happening. And so my book, it's kind of a deep dive into a lot of that stuff, but also how it feels for a couple like us.
Yeah, there's so much there, just off that,
Sure.
I
Sure.
heard about OJ. I heard one of the jurors interviewed, and she said, we knew that he was guilty, but you know what? We just wanted to win. We wanted to win. And I think that
Mhm.
it shows this narrative that that, this narrative of how Black people are being, hunted down and killed by authorities, by the government, by police, like George Floyd got a lot of publicity. And
Hmm.
that's not taken away from what happened. And we don't have to go into the details of that because there's
Yeah.
all kinds of like
They're very
controversy on that.
complex. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
complex case to arbitrate.
But he got a lot more attention than Tony Timpa. I don't know if you're familiar with the Tony Timpa
I
case,
am.
but
I am.
it's a very interesting one because there's so many similarities between them,
Sure.
and yet Tony Timpa didn't get the kind of publicity. Or are you familiar with the Daniel Shavers
I
case?
am. I
That's
am.
another one like that. When you watch that video, you're like, oh, that's so horrific. It's so horrific. But he was white. And it's that idea of, what if he had been Black? Would it have been a bigger story? Would it have been, seen as a racially motivated thing?
Mhm.
But we're like products of the media that we consume, and
We are.
the media stories are just bigger and they're more polarizing. They get more clicks. The free market has come into the news paradigm, and so
Mhm.
we got to get clicks. How are we going to get the most clicks? By selling rage and selling hate and selling division, and getting people fired up emotionally, and bringing race in because of our very complicated history. You're talking about Mississippi. I mean, I believe that's where Emmett Till was killed.
Well,
I mean,
absolutely.
there's a
Yeah.
real history there, of horrific treatment of racial
Hmm.
minorities, and then playing into that it can cloud us into understanding what is actually going on, and you can. And then that you can go into the work of Roland Fryer and what he
Absolutely.
revealed,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was a little counter to what the narrative was, but like, and then you talk about like the rage that people feel. Jussie
Mhm.
Smollett, and everyone jumped on board saying, Jussie Smollett,
Yeah.
this was all like a horrible hate crime. But then in Wilfred Riley, his book Hate Crime Hoax, it revealed that there's actually more fake hate crimes than real hate crimes in America, which is
And
pretty
and I've read
startling.
that book, and I should say also, of course, I know Tony Timpa because one thing that happened in the summer of 2020, and here I need to tag back a little bit. I have another life as a YouTube blues harmonica guy with a lot of supposed subscribers. They never show up, but I've got a lot of people out there. And the first time I ever lost my voice as a YouTube blues harmonica guy was the summer of 2020. I used to sit in the front of my car, and it was a couple of weeks after George Floyd was killed, and it's the only video that I've never uploaded because I didn't know up from down, right from wrong. I knew right from wrong, but I didn't know whether I had a voice left to speak about this, and I thought I should. Maybe blues harmonica stuff is not the place, but occasionally I go into politics. And then I did the following. People were saying, and remember, what happened in the summer of 2020 was everybody said, listen to Black voices. Well, I mean, I live, my wife,
Which
my
Black
son, I live in
voices?
a minority white home, right? If you want to put it that way, but listen to
Yeah.
Black voices. What I did was I began basically to listen to podcasts, and the first one I came across was Megan Murphy with Coleman Hughes,
Yeah.
Same Drugs. I'd never heard of Coleman Hughes. And then I listened to Sam, maybe that was the second, Sam Harris, Can We Pull Back from the Brink, which was a
Yeah.
remarkable thing in the early June of 2020, where he
That was a great
basically said,
podcast.
I could ask Coleman Hughes or Glenn Lowry or Thomas Chatterton Williams or John McWhorter to come on this program. And I had not, I knew a bit vaguely of Lowry, never heard of Coleman Hughes. McWhorter, I thought of him as a kind of stuffy literary guy. But man, what I began to do was listen. I discovered the Lowry McWhorter dialogues, and I began to listen to Black voices that were not Eddie Glaude Jr., somebody I really liked. He's a Mississippian, somebody who would take the sort of left position, the left academic position. But I began to listen to a range of voices that were sort of from, like me, kind of old school liberal, but all the way to sort of center right, and it really opened my eyes to some of the problematics. So I think we're talking the same language, um, and so I began to sort of think for myself, and bit by bit found my way back from where I'd gone. I began to find my voice again, and one of the places that led to, I should just say, my book begins with a prologue that's not at all about a love story, really. It's about a 2003 sort of white activist training session, sort of focused on anti-racist work, do the work, right? That I attended in a location. I put it on the West Coast, but I sort of changed location. Um, I'll- I was really interested in the language of or the discourses of racial healing in Clinton era America. So one of the long tail results of OJ and that trial and the LA riots on the heels of Rodney King. I always loved Rodney King, right? Can we all get along, right? I mean, I'm coming from that Rodney King plea. Can we all get along? Can we? But one of the long tail effects was that in Clinton's America, there was a lot of dialogue about racial healing, and I was interested in that. And there were a range of ways people were doing that kind of work. But one of including New Age racial healing, and we could talk about that. It's kind of loopy, but interesting. Marianne Williamson comes out of that, actually. And I
Mhm.
went to some stuff with her where she did prayers for racial healing. But one of the things that you get when you look at that work is there's a kind of work, that is white people by themselves, not like KKK, but the other extreme. But it's still white identitarian. We're going to identify as white. You walk in the room, there are 14 activists, and the two trainers go, "Welcome, white people." And that unnerved me, but I got their permission to come to this event. And I'm not going to give it away, but through a sort of complicated series of things, following on the heels of the intersectional stack that they taught us, which is to say, if you're me, if you're white, male, straight, presumptively middle or upper class. I had Princeton attached to my name, so it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. I was a working class kid from a small downstate New York town, but did have Princeton attached to my name, and I'm an academic. You're a problem in some way. You have all the power. In my book, I sort of take that apart and talk about all the ways I was mentored by older black men in which they had much of the power, much of the cultural power, much of the knowledge that I didn't have. And I was there. I mean, we can talk about my experience as a Harlem street musician. But long story short, what ended up happening is that I said what was felt to be the wrong thing. And it was so much the wrong thing. I'm a guy, again, I lived in black contexts in a range of ways and taught black lit in the classroom. But in the eyes of this white activist cohort, I had said the wrong thing. And I didn't have the term struggle session at that moment. I only learned that in the summer of 2020. Actually, thanks to Chris Rufo, who I'm not a big follower of, but in the summer of 2020, he did great muckraking work. I was put in the center of a struggle session, and I was told I needed to, I would shut up. I would not be allowed to say anything. And we'd go around the circle, and each person who'd been offended by what I said would be allowed to speak at whatever length they felt was necessary in order to tell me how I had made them feel and how I had outraged their sense of justice. And eventually I fought back. Something inside me said, there's a complete lack of proportion between my supposed offense and the amount of hate that my fellow citizens have been primed by this intersectional grid and then allowed to dump down on me. And I fought back. And I said, basically, you couldn't get away with this in Harlem. Which they couldn't have, because in Harlem, everybody
Right.
gets to say their piece. And I had learned that. I'd been a street musician in Harlem. So, like, this was a total. But what I do is I then fast forward. And so when I began to see what was happening leading up to 2020, but certainly in 2020, I said, wait a minute, that thing I did, that was a struggle session back then. And that's where we are now. And they're saying basically that this ought to be the formation that retrains all the white people who are implicitly racist. And so that was the idea of, Robin DiAngelo, and I think you're racist, don't even know it. And it's a stain. So there's a kind of existential or almost religious foundation of that. Anyway, I'm rambling as professors do, but my book has that too. It starts off there and it says basically, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. So what does? And there's a kind of reset. I have a little brief introduction. These are all sort of the Roman numeral portion of my book, about 50 pages of Roman numerals, prologue and introduction. Then we get to the love story. The introduction sort of says, let's go back to the early civil rights movement. Let's go back to John Lewis. And there was a passage that I would like to read if I might, because it's the epigraph to one of my chapters. It's the epigraph to the introduction. And this is John Lewis talking to Krista Tippett on Being in 2016. So this was never published, but I transcribed it. I mean, it was on a web page that transcribed it. He's talking about what it was like to be in that interracial cohort of social activists in the early 60s, SNCC, early SNCC. And he says, you live as if you're already there, that you're already in that community, part of that sense of one family, one house. If you visualize it, if you can even have faith that it's there for you, it is already there. So sort of prophetic, imagining yourself forward, and family's a part of it. And during the early days of the movement, I believe that the only true and real integration for that sense of the beloved community existed within the movement itself, because in the final analysis, we did become a circle of trust, a band of brothers and sisters. So it didn't matter whether you were black or white, like my wife or me. It didn't matter whether you came from the North, me, or from the South, her, or whether you're a Northerner or Southerner, we were one. And what he was talking about was a moment in American history when there was this brotherhood of an interracial brotherhood and sisterhood that really lived in sort of in a space beyond race, a kind of imagined space, a kind of utopian space, a kind of idea, but a space where they were working it out really. And in a funny way, what I'm arguing, the one of the three top line things in my book is that we might look to interracial families for how race could work in America if it were working right. It's so easy to look in the other direction. That is the melodrama, right? That's the monetized melodrama. That's what activates everybody. But what about when it's working right? You know, my wife's a private person. She's beautiful. She's friendly, and you'd never imagine that she's private in that way, because she seems very friendly and forward and very non-judgmental, which I love, very centered. But she wasn't, when I first talked about doing this, she was not totally sold on it. It's like, well, if you have a good thing, why should we let like mean people know about it in a funny way? And I can't blame her for thinking that. And then I said, and she agreed. I said, but here's the thing. I said, everybody knows the bad stuff. They know about Emmett Till. Wright Thompson's just written this amazing book about Emmett Till. They know that story, but they don't know our story. They don't. And if you don't ever put out the way that things work, things that work well, right? Especially on racial terms, if you don't ever put that out there and just say, see what you can do with this, then nobody will know. And I think that sold her. She was like, because she actually always looks on the positive side. She tries not to look on the negative side. So,
yeah, you know, it's interesting. I mean, maybe this is because I'm in Los Angeles, but a majority of my friends are in interracial marriages. My wife is Filipino.
Okay.
So, you know, our kids are mixed, and I found that because I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania, and everyone that I had, you know, dated and knew, a lot of the girls and stuff like that, they were all white. They were like me. And then when I came out to California, there was just this cornucopia of just like different kinds of people. And it was so interesting to go on dates with people that were very different culturally and racially and ethnically. And it was just like, wow, this is intriguing for me as like a viewpoint diversity critical thinker person. I was like, now I can learn about all these people who have these different backgrounds. And my wife and I, she doesn't like when I say this because our core ideas are very, very similar, but we are very different. And that's attractive. It's like, oh, what am I missing? Like that's something that's very attractive to me. And I think that what we're seeing now is more people are open to interracial marriage, but they're turned off to like interpolitical marriage or relationships. Like I won't date a Republican, or I won't date a Democrat. And I
that
think
is where people have gotten to. Yeah.
Yeah. You're missing that because the beautiful thing about my wife isn't just that, you know, as far as like our differences, isn't that she, you know, looks different or is from a different country and, you know, has different skin color. It's not that. It's the fact that she thinks differently. And that's what's so cool. And that's what's challenging, but it's a beautiful thing where we're raising our sons is like, wow, we have two different paradigms about like everything, like how to load the dishwasher. And in doing that, you know, iron sharpens iron, and we can get to what's really works in your culture, what really works in mine, and we can kind of blend those things. And that's beautiful. I think people are missing out on that because they'll date someone who looks differently than them, but it's like a laptop. Like you have different stickers in your laptop, but you have the same software running, then how different is it? And I think that's when you said the thing about like, you know, listen to Black voices or elevate Black voices. What happened that I saw in K through 12 was people were saying the exact same Black voices all around. And then when I'd share McWhorter and Glenn Lowry's podcast with people, they were like, oh, I've never heard this perspective before. Like I've never heard the perspective of like Glenn is a pretty open, like conservative Black person. And like, and they were just like, wow, I had no idea. You know, so it's this idea that all people from this culture think alike. And I've had 9 different transgender people on the podcast and they think differently. Like really to understand. Yeah. It's been really cool. Like to understand that like people are diverse. We're all the ultimate minority in being the individual. And when you start to understand that, then it kind of breaks down those barriers that are dividing us, and you see like, wow, we have a lot to learn from everybody. But that includes race, but includes a whole bunch of other things as well. And when
So
you
viewpoint
clear
diversity can
yourself
be
off,
aligned with race to some extent, but not, it isn't necessarily aligned with race. I mean,
yeah,
so there's a strange thing, like in class terms, I grew up in and we probably have certain things in common. You say Eastern Pennsylvania, I want to go where?
oh,
Where
like
in East?
Bethlehem area,
Yeah, yeah, I know
like Lehigh
Bethlehem. Yeah,
University.
I've driven through on 78 every time I drive from Mississippi to New York, and
Yeah,
I've played
yeah,
gigs at there was a little folk club in Bethlehem we used to play.
oh, yeah.
Yeah, what's your Bethlehem what's the sister city of Bethlehem?
Allentown.
Allentown and
Yeah,
Bethlehem, right? Very different cities, but still
yeah.
same. Okay. So I grew up in a downstate New York town, product of a mixed marriage. My father was Jewish. My mother was Dutch Reformed, so she was Christian. We were sort of non-denominational. Grew up without religion, but Jewish grandmother down in New York. They had money. We did not have that money. They had money. I had a rich Jewish grandmother down in New York who was a working class. She'd grown up working class in Harlem, like in a shop. And my grandfather had come over from Europe and ended up making some money in business journalism. They lived in Sutton Place. She wore mink stalls, but she was like a it was like crazy, right? And I was the townie at the local day school. We didn't think of it as a prep school. It was kind of a druggy day school. And I was my brother and I were the townies, the smart townies, and the valedictorians at this little school. My wife grew up working class in South Dallas. She has junior college. I have MA and a PhD. None of that mattered finally, and that was one of the interesting things when you meet the right person, and we were 20 years and counting. And I thought I'd met the right person twice before with 2 5-year live-in relationships. They weren't. They weren't. She is, and she was, and you have the differences are important. I do think that sometimes there's harmony. So what I would say is I felt that word harmony, and in my book I write about it, sort of floating into the lived space that encompassed us at a certain moment fairly early, and it was an unfamiliar word. Drama, I mean excitement, but harmony, that's interesting. And it just turned out that I needed her. I needed the person who has what she has, but also her. I mean, and so the individual is important. I do think we should probably talk about families and how families respond. That is a part of interracial relationships. And I'm curious. So sometimes families have a problem. Did you, from your family or from her family, did anybody have a problem when you guys said, hey, we're a thing, or hey, we want to get married, we want to have
No,
kids? How did it?
it's a good question, but no. I mean, part of the reason is because my family is, Eastern, upper middle class, all college educated and very, liberal Democrat. And they are just like, oh, we love the idea of diversity because they haven't had it. Like my whole life growing up, like one black person has ever stepped foot in my house. And that was like the one black in my neighborhood that I just happened to be friends with. My parents didn't have any like racial minority friends or anything like that. But, they have that element of like Democrat, East Coast liberal of like, oh, we love that diversity. And then in Filipino culture, especially coming here from Manila, my wife was like 8 years old, is like this idea of marrying into like a person, like a family of people who look like me, like the clean cut white boy, like that was like very like alluring. It's like, oh, we made it because you married into this family. But that was the initial. But then it's like once you get past the aesthetics of it, and my family realized that like it's not just the aesthetics, it's the other stuff. It's the way that we understand morals. Like morals are different based on culture and stuff. That's where the tension really happened. And they would always refuse to acknowledge that it was because of culture or race and just say like, well, it's just because of her. But like the way that they lived was just seen as different. And the way that my family grew up is like, this is the way you do things. This is the way you work. This is the way you raise your kids. This is the right way. And they hadn't been exposed to like that there's a lot of different ways that you can raise kids properly. Sure. There's a lot of different ways that you can, employ people or not, like all of that kind of stuff. So that's where it happened, is once we got a little bit deeper. On the surface, it's like, oh, this is wonderful. But then when it got on the surface, most of my family doesn't even talk to me or my wife anymore.
Most of your family does. So I do think, and thank you for being that honest. I mean, I think in my case, one of the through lines in my book, well, my father died in '96, but my mother was delighted. at Sherry. And I mean, at no point ever any suggestion that that was a problem. There was the question then. I was living in Mississippi. Then I met this woman. The idea of Match.com, that was sort of a funny thing back then. These days, I think nobody thinks twice about that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
what year was this? Because I met my wife in
It was 2000.
2010.
I
It
met
was
her
a
in
little embarrassing.
2002.
Oh, that's
2002.
that's early.
That's early, right? It was
Yeah.
still called Match.com at that point. But
Yeah.
but we and so we had the marriage at Riverside Church in New York. I had a we with one of their ministers. That was just a place we wanted to get. We got married there because I could have my New Agey. I was kind of in New Agey church for a couple of years, A Course in Miracles, in New York before I moved down south. And so we had everybody came except for one person. So and I should just say on my wife's side, her mother did not want to have anything to do with me for about 15 years. And why it bothered Sherry, and that's a line that carries through. My book ends with an amazing moment of reconciliation at her invitation, and there's a lesson there too. It's the kid, in the final scene of my book, I see that there's 3 photos of our son. So a cute kid can have a long-term effect, but it took a long time for her to get there, and then suddenly I was fine. But early on, her daughter is leaving Dallas. She had a lot of brothers and sisters. Her daughter's leaving Dallas and coming to Mississippi and marrying a white man. That was a lot for a woman who grew up in Waco, Texas. I'm talking about my wife's mother. So those problematics are there. They weren't there on my side of the family. Everybody in my side of the family, New York and downstate New York City and downstate New York, liberal, Jewish. And actually my cousin, my first cousin in New York, Ethan Gussow, his wife is Filipino or part Filipino. It's interesting, and their marriage worked famously. I think she's Hapa. She's kind of half, I think.
Yep.
But anyway, so yes, America is an increasingly multiracial, multicultural place.
Yeah.
Here I want to take a quick little side jog and mention, when I talk about my book, I have 3 frames about it. One of the frames, the third frame, we can talk about other frames, is for us to think about my marriage in terms of loving the Virginia, right? So in 1967, there was a very famous Supreme Court decision that basically ruled out all the remaining anti-miscegenation, anti-race mixing statutes that were on the books that said basically, let's say in the state of Mississippi, my wife and I can't get married. Right? And it ruled all those out. 1958, the year I was born, I think was the year that the Lovings got together, Richard and Mildred Loving. So they're a couple who grows up in Central Point, Virginia. It's kind of east, it's like a little country town or crossroads almost, where everybody is comfortably mixed up, east of Richmond, 20 miles east of Richmond. And they grow up and they're basically girl and boy next door, and they get married. And I'm interested in the long tail of that decision. So I'm interested in how America changes. I think in '58, if you look at the, I forget what the statistic is. I've got the statistic somewhere. 4%. So in '58, there was 4% approval for black-white marriage in America. 4% of the public approved. In 2020, 94% approved. So if you're somebody who says America's incurably racist, nothing ever changes, I talk about Afro-pessimism in passing, but it's one of the things that I'm sort of pushing against, the idea that America was founded in racism and ultimately nothing ever changes. They're probably feeling pretty good right now because I think the current administration has weaponized the phrase DEI. We can talk about that if you want. But what has changed is public attitudes towards interracial marriage. Now, it is possible, because American history works this way, that things are swinging back. We may find now that there's a sort of insurgent white replacement theorist kind of dynamic that says, Will and Adam, you should not marry outside your white race, right? There are people out there like that. We can't forget it. They're out there. But by and large, the mass of American public opinion is fine and says no biggie, right? That's part of what I'm trying to do with my book is say, we're a normie interracial couple in contemporary Mississippi. And even that phrase, given Mississippi's long history, given America's history, that's kind of a curious phrase. And so that might be one reason why somebody might want to look into my book. It's like, what would that be like if you actually could live a pretty good life? And my argument is that we actually have lived a pretty good life here in contemporary Mississippi with all of its dark history. And how does that happen? And maybe you don't know what Mississippi's like, right? The person who thinks it can't possibly happen, but it has happened. And one other sort of, when I talk about loving the Virginia, here's an interesting thing. You want to have a deep conversation. Back in 2022, I just reminded myself, printed out the syllabus of a course that I designed, a graduate course called Before and After Loving, Worrying the Color Line in Southern and Post-Southern Autobiography. And that sounds like an English professor's sort of, that's the kind of way we would, right? I mean, that's the language that, it's my stock and trade. But I was interested in basically interracial family memoirs, like what happens, start in the South, but also outside the South, post-Southern, maybe they move. And I was thinking back to James McBride's book, which in the 90s, that was the one that kind of started this whole thing, which was called The Color of Water, A Black Man's Tribute to His White Mother. So think about that, comes out in 95. We're having OJ, right? The trial is like coming to a head at the fall of 95. And you have this book, Black Man's Tribute to His White Mother. What happens if we sort of track down a bunch of those? How many are there? And I was interested in that tradition. And there was Shirley Taylor Hazlitt, The Sweeter the Juice, A Family's Memoir in Black and White. Scott Minerbrook, amazing, heartbreaking. He was like an NPR reporter. Divided at the Vein, A Journey into Race and Family. Basically, he's from a black mother and a white father, or black father, white mother, I don't remember. The point is the white side of the family are basically Arkansas rednecks, and he goes and he hunts down the father, it's just guy does not want to talk to him. It's heartbreaking. Bliss Broyard and the literary critic Anatole Broyard, who was Creole. His daughter did a thing. He was a Times critic and hit it. Thomas Chatterton Williams, of course, Self-Portrait in Black and White. There's a range of books. Here's the interesting thing. When I went back after finishing my own book, and I said, it's weird. I look at my syllabus. There were no white guys as authors of these books. So I've written one, but surely there are others. Let me go and figure out what those are. And I was only able to find one. And it's by William Cohen, the former defense secretary, right, and Senator William Cohen, who married a black TV anchor in midlife, and it's called Love in Black and White, a sort of a memoir of race, and I forget the full title. That was the only one I could find. So I thought, well, obviously I need to look harder. I looked harder and harder, couldn't find anything. I asked people, nobody could name anything. So finally I went to two academics who were sort of elite Ivy League sort of senior scholars who specialize in race and interrace. One was a scholar, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I said, can you please tell me, like, there must be these autobiographies by white men about their black wives, their mixed families. There must be those in history. I taught one, by the way, my colleague, I don't know why this isn't here, Ralph Eubanks here at Ole Miss. The House at the End of the Road was a book about his grandfather, who was a white man married to a black woman in rural Alabama at the turn of the 20th century, the dawn of the 20th century. Very interesting, fascinating, but he didn't write a book, right? His grandson, Ralph Eubanks, wrote a book. And that neither one of them could find anything else. So it appears that for whatever reason, in the 57, 58 years since Loving, and back into American history, it appears that white men have not written these books, even though everybody else is now talking about these interracial families. And one question I would ask you, I got a couple of responses, interesting suggestions when I asked this as an open question. Why is that? Why do you think that is? I don't know, a couple of different possibilities. Why would you think, if you knew that?
I think that, if we're talking about today in 2025, I think that people, when it comes to racial issues, something that I've experienced is like, it's not, which is crazy because of your situation, but like, it's not your story to tell. Like you can't talk about, because you're in the power position. It goes back to those, like, those power, the oppressor versus oppressed stuff. You're in the power position. So you shouldn't be telling the story because you're going to tell it from the perspective of something in power. I have to assume that there's some element of that being at play.
And so I think that and then a publishing industry's
Hmm.
embrace of that
Yeah.
idea, right?
Yeah.
So my
Yeah, I
editor
think
is a guy named
so.
Adam Bello, who Saul Bello's son. A very he's a fairly well-known literary editor. He happens to be somewhat more conservative than me, kind of neoconservative, but very open-minded too. And he was like, well, this is a story that should be told. Here's the weird thing then. And so this is the funny thing. So number one is, even though those memoirs are not out there, if you go to YouTube and you put an interracial
Yeah.
relationship or interracial family, what you'll find is Gabe and Babe. You'll find all of this stuff. You go to Facebook, I get sent
Hmm.
interracial relationship, interracial marriage, and couple after couple after couple, white guy and black woman, right?
Hmm.
So there's no, the stigma's gone. There's no stigma anymore
Yeah.
to this, and the YouTube are very. There's a lot of parody. So the couple is sort of saying, "Well, here's what it's like to be us," and it's all that sort of vlogging, I guess it's called. There's a
Hmm.
lot of that out there. But yeah, I think here's what it means, though. It means then, and here's one more thing that's really important to factor into this. There's a thriving genre of books I was utterly unaware of. It turned out my wife knew about them, but I didn't. That are called, and I would urge your audience to Google this. BW/WM romances. Just go to Amazon Books and
Okay.
put in BW/WM romances, or go to Google, and you'll find hundreds of these books.
Yeah.
All of them, interestingly enough, written by black women.
Hmm.
I tried real hard. I couldn't find, because I wanted a sort of precedent for what I'm doing. And I thought, so there's somebody buying these books. Um, Prima facie evidence would be they're probably, if they're written by black women, they're probably for black women who are interested in the idea of maybe a fantasy figure. He's like a white prince or a business, not a
Yeah.
prince really, but a business guy or a famous athlete or something. But so there's this interest and hunger out there. But in the world of memoirs, you don't get to be a white guy saying, "I love this woman, and I want you to know why. I want you to know what's special, and I want you to know about the life that we've created for ourselves." That's what it means if you don't let a guy like me write this book.
Yeah.
And you don't get the challenge of being, I'm a father too, and my book is very much about what does it mean to father this son, and to raise him right. I mean, my wife and I are still doing that. He's a freshman, and if you had a freshman second, spring term of freshman year, there's always crises of various kinds. I'm not going to go into it. It's just that you're trying to get him through, right? And so we have a real partnership, but you don't know that. And so that's one of the reasons I wrote my book is I'm trying to talk about fatherhood. And as a result of that, I'll be honest, there's a chapter called South of Haunted Dreams where I take on very full frontally Ta-Nehisi Coates, Jesmyn Ward, and Imani Perry,
Hmm.
all three of whose works I read, admire. Certainly Jesmyn Ward is a brilliant novelist. But specifically with Perry and Ward, both of them, I think, if you look at the way that they responded to Trayvon Martin, who was he was a tall 5'11". He was big. He wasn't heavy. He was much taller than George Zimmerman, but he outweighed him.
Yep.
And he was embraced by his friends as a mixed martial arts fighter, a guy who could really give it. And I sensed that what they wanted to do was infantilize him. It was almost like
Hmm.
in order to make him a part of the family, they had to, they, Trayvon wouldn't hurt a fly.
Wait,
And when I thought about,
Trayvon, he trained mixed martial arts?
he didn't train mixed martial arts. He fought mixed martial arts type fighting. He didn't actually train. No, he was really good with his
He
fists.
was like a street fighter.
He was a street fighter,
I didn't
and
know
and
that.
that's of course
Okay.
exactly what John Good, who was the witness who
Mm.
actually saw. He didn't see how the fight started, but he saw him beating down. He saw him beating down Zimmerman. It was pretty clear. This was long
Yeah.
before anybody understood what was going on. But John Good he's a guy whose testimony was very important. What I realized when I thought about this is I took my education, which was an African American lit, and I thought about a very famous novel, one of the most famous American novels now by Zora Neale Hurston, a black Florida slash Alabama writer, called Their Eyes Were Watching God. Some of it very well known. It's taught a lot in universities. It's about a young black woman in the 20s who has a couple of bad marriages and then ends up being romanced by a blues guy 10 years younger than her, a guy named Tea Cake. Tea Cake is incredible for her. He gives her everything that the other men in her life didn't give her, makes her love herself and all sorts of things. But he's also a juke joint fighter. And at one point she goes, Tea Cake wouldn't hurt a fly. That can, he wouldn't hurt a fly. And at that point he sort of falls back into her house, bragging about how he took a knife or a razor and just sliced up another guy in the juke joint. Now, as a scholar of the blues, I know that knives and guns and knives were very much a part of the juke joint environment. This is in Central Florida. This is near Sanford, where this is all taking place, which is where Trayvon Martin was. And what I was interesting is that Hurston is a brilliant enough novelist to force us to understand that Tea Cake would hurt a fly, and that if you're going to love him, you got to embrace everything about him, including the part of him, the dark side, if you will. At the end of the novel, he gets bitten by a rabid dog and he ends up trying to shoot Janie. And by that point, she actually tragically has to shoot him and kill him. But he's taught her how to shoot. So the violence he has is a part of what actually makes her a full human being. Anyway, all by way of saying that when I looked at Trayvon, trying to understand what had happened, not trying to argue a case one way or the other, just trying to say, what's preponderance of the evidence standard? What happened? What I end up coming down to, and I would urge people to read the way I arbitrated, is what Charles Barkley said, which is basically, yeah, even though there was no evidence of racial animosity at all to be found in George Zimmerman's background, by the time he came to Trayvon, there had been enough break-ins, most of them by black men, at the reserve, the place they all lived. There had been enough break-ins that he'd been soured on young black men. And so when he sees Zimmerman, when he sees Trayvon that night, he says, these assholes, they always get away. He presumes, and I think Trayvon what I think is that Trayvon was basically, no, he wasn't breaking into some place this night. He was just talking to a girl on the phone. And he realized he was being profiled. And so he circled back 90 seconds later and tried to beat Zimmerman down, and Zimmerman happened to have a gun. And the question is, if that's what, and that's what Barkley said. I believe he was profiled, Barkley said, but yeah, I think he came back and he tried to beat down Zimmerman. And if that's what you believe, but I think we have to be able to first say it and say that there's this and there's this. Then how do you guide your son? How do you guide your son? And I'm not going to go into that, but I try to sort of extract some life lessons from that. And I think that they don't. They want to say, they keep calling Trayvon boy, he's just a boy, he's a kid, a child. I hate to say it, but I've had a 17-year-old, he's now 19, he weighs 240 pounds. He was large at 17 and strong. And so of course I'm concerned when I see what happened to George Floyd, a large, strong guy. Of course I'm concerned, but I'm also concerned with giving him the best possible advice. And it's not useful to me once I've investigated Roland Fryer, right? And the Washington Post database, and I went and did all that, and I talk about it. Once you do all that, what you got to do is say, well, how do you actually behave with the police? I had to give him the talk. And here's, when I gave him my son the talk, like a professor I was, I asked him, you ever heard of the talk? I said, come on, I need to talk. You ever heard of the talk? And he's like, no. And I said, well, it's when a father, usually a black father, talks to his son, and I began to sort of say what it was, and he goes, oh, that won't be a problem for me. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, everybody in school thinks I'm Mexican or Egyptian, so it won't be a problem for me. Well, one of the things I try to do is help people understand that there are elements of unexpected moments of crazy comedy, But my son obviously was not worried about. He's not worried about moving out into the world, even in Mississippi. And the truth is, this happened after the book was in print or in press. My son was stopped in 2 points in the car by the cops, and both times he was fine. Both times he did exactly what I told him to do. Have your license and registration ready to go, hands on the wheel, be polite. right? I mean, those protocols make a difference. And it doesn't do to say, my son's just a child, he's just a boy. Well, no, he's actually a teen. He's 17. That's a
Yeah.
problematic age. I got to know what's in him so that I can minister to it. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
long-winded answer. I'm not sure where
Now,
we began, but yeah,
yeah, and I think the talk is something that I think every boy, regardless of race, like the idea of, fight it in court, don't fight it on the street. The idea of don't look like a threat. I mean,
yeah,
that's something that should be able to transcend racial lines as well.
thank you.
I have a question for you. Like
Sure.
the concept that I talk about in my courses is like prevalence induced concept change. This idea that over time, when the prevalence of something becomes less and less and less, then what is perceived as that thing starts to get highlighted more. So they do this with like adding purple like elements to blue dots and stuff. And as purple becomes less and less frequent, then what they see as purple, gets highlighted where it's just blue dots, or
Okay.
something along those lines. And I wonder how much of that, Chris Rock had a joke years and years ago about how racism has changed over time. He talks about how he's like, black people say that they can't get a taxi in New York City. You can't get a taxi. He's like, then you talk to an old black man. He's like, we were the taxi. A white man just jump on your back and say, take a left. Like this idea of racism, like the real, like undeniable, like using the N-word, believing that this group of people is inferior to that group of people. That kind of racism is less prevalent today than it had been in the past. So do we move the goalposts and say, like, now if you compliment someone's hair, or you make some sort of comment that's typically would have been innocuous just like, a generation or two ago, that's deemed as racist? Because that's what I'm seeing more and more and more, is this idea, or they could call it dog whistling or something along those lines, but this idea that what is considered racist has changed. And just a generation or two ago, that would not have even been considered racism, because there was like, quote unquote, real racism. There was deeper seated racism. And I wonder how much that plays a role in what's happening now. Because you look at these organizations, the Southern Poverty Law Center and all these others, is they're in the fighting racism business. And something that I tell my students is like, if you're in the Save the Pandas Foundation, and then you fly a helicopter, you go, wow, panda numbers are thriving. Like, you have 10 employees, you're having these fundraisers and stuff like that. Like, you can't say we've solved it. Like, the goal of these anti-racist institutions is to stop racism. So the goal of a business or a nonprofit or an organization, NGO, whatever it is to go out of business. So then what happens if you would ever meet your goal? Like, I wonder how much that plays a role, because the Southern Poverty Law Center got into some really goofy things about what they're deeming as racist now. And they got in some trouble. There's some big lawsuits and things, like, because they're kind of shifting the goalposts on what would be considered racism. How much do you think that plays a role in what's going on today in like 2025?
It's a good question. So one way to think about it might be that the prevalence of the term microaggressions. I've never liked that phrase. Certainly, I've been in positions where people, I guess you'd say, they microaggressed against me. But I think part of growing up in being Brazilian is figuring out a way to deal with that. I do think so. One way that people might think this through is they might say, well, there was a civil rights movement, and in '64 with the Civil Rights Act of '64 and '65, the Voting Rights Act of '65, some of the fundamental goals of the civil rights movement were achieved. And then with Loving v. Virginia, sort of all of that, like a lot of things came down, right? A lot of barriers came down. There were, of course, what happened at that point? Well, of course, Martin Luther King shifted his goal, so that, and also what happened, of course, is the rise of the Black Power movement. So I sort of a Black identitarian, as somebody who's taught elements of that movement and certainly understands why it felt historically necessary, I get it. Of course, there were all these riots right after the summer of '65 is when that thing started to explode, and we had explosions in urban zones for a long period after that. I do think that race. I mean, if we just look back to the LAPD in the early '90s, the Daryl Gates LAPD. I mean, I think there were some real problems there. There were some inherited long-term problems. If we look if we look at 2014 and Ferguson, Missouri, one of my arguments in the book is that that the Obama holder DOJ, which put out two reports, one on the death of Michael Brown and one on the Ferguson Police Department, actually got it right. And that satisfies nobody, because what they said is, and I realize I'm moving laterally, but what they said is Darren Wilson, used force appropriately. His testimony is unimpeachable, thanks to 6 black witnesses, and I quote them all at length. 6 black witnesses who were believable and whose testimony agreed with the forensics and everything else, the ballistics and forensics. We know that basically Michael Brown was charging him, and that Wilson retreated, used force appropriately, but he was the one. Seems like the one decent cop in an otherwise morally bankrupt department. So there was a lot of racism in the Ferguson PD, in people's not only in disparities, and like every single time a police dog was used on a black person in Ferguson. Never
or
on a white.
stop and frisk in New York City is kind of similar.
Yeah, and so, and that's 2014. So, it's the argument that there are systemic problems on the citywide level, the police force level. There's some strength to that argument, I think. But if systemic is understood to be sort of all of America, I don't buy that for a minute. I think we have to get a lot more local. But yeah, there are places where racism shows up as attitudinal racism, and I do think that that's been unleashed to some extent now. I will say by. You can be a critic of DEI as it was affected, as I am, as it sort of turned out, and yet still know that the way that the acronym DEI is being used now is to stigmatize what we might call black excellence. Any black person at all up there is now almost suspect. If they've risen, it had to be because of DEI, which is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous.
Of course.
It's ridiculous. But there it is. You have to live that tension. You said concept. It's like concept creep.
Yeah.
And you specifically were talking about sort of organizational dynamics. So the idea that if you're the I'm trying to think. So once gay marriage was a thing with Obergefell, then trans rights became the next thing, and there are ways in which organizations either they modulate. The ACLU then became sort of in a sort of trans rights direction that some people found a little excessive. Trans rights per se are great, but I know you've had conversations about this. Yeah. What I can do is I can say that I do think the attitude you project, whoever you are, makes a difference. And so my wife, who's been here at the University of Mississippi, she's basically ministers in the pharmacy program, ministers to graduate students. She's an accountant, but who's sort of an administrative person, beloved by the many. It's totally international cohort of graduate students. I don't write about that in the book. I didn't want to talk about her work life, but she rarely has an experience of. She barely comes home and says, "I think I got microaggressed." She's not inclined to. She's confident in herself, and that may make a difference. So she's not sort of looking for the person who says the stupid thing. And yet, there were a couple of incidents of overt racism that I do report in my book, and they were connected. They were both connected with the Trump election the first time, which is that they came out of the woodwork. One of them was just some young teen, preteen, 12-year-old kid leaning out a car door and just using the N-word repeatedly at my wife in the Walmart parking lot in Oxford, Mississippi. It's like, okay.
Yes, that's still real. That still exists. Yeah.
So it still exists.
Yeah.
But and there was a moment after I was in a long-term interracial musical relationship with an older black musician from Mississippi who I met in Harlem, and we went under the name Satan and Adam. It's a long story. It's part of my book. It's in my book, this book. And there was a big photo of me and Sterling in the Oxford Eagle, like the local newspaper. Big kind of promo photo when the documentary called Satan and Adam came out in 2018. It was on Netflix. It was in the Tribeca Film Festival, then on Netflix for a couple of years. And the week after that, I was on tour, and my wife called and said, "Honey, there's a big cardboard box doesn't have the normal like return address, and it's just like in front of our door. When she woke up in the morning, she called me, and I said, "Well, get the cops to come. That does sound weird." And then she called me after the cops had come, and she said, "Well, they opened it up. There was nothing, just a bunch of trash in it." And I thought, okay, somebody's signifying they're calling us trash. Like, are they calling me trash because they saw that article? And it's one of the places where she and I actually had different interpretations, because my interpretation was somebody saw the photo in the newspaper and thought, here's this Ole Miss professor and Satan. Like, maybe they hated that, right? You're trash because you play with a guy who names himself after the devil. Like, that's an obvious enough thing. And she was like, I think it's about us here in this house.
Interesting.
We never could agree. That's one of those moments where, but we both knew that that package was signifying, and somebody out there, we didn't let it haunt us. We just, because Oxford was not that kind of a place, but one can easily imagine how that sort of thing, if repeated, could profoundly bother you, profoundly destabilize your sense of neighborhood. I mean, we'd never had any problem in our neighborhood. We've been here since 2007. It's a mixed neighborhood that way. Anyway,
Yeah.
I didn't really give a full answer, but I do think that I love the way that Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter kind of arbitrate this. You know, what's changed? Lowry will say that racism's not nearly as prevalent as it was, and anybody who's older would remember those days.
Mhm.
It's still out there. I don't think it's as prevalent. I do think, though, that when you're a couple like us, when the political environment changes, you kind of hold a finger to the wind.
Yeah.
I learned this back in the late 80s when I was playing on the street in Harlem, and when New York was exploding, kind of the way LA did a little bit later. There was the so-called Howard Beach killing, 3 black men whose car broke down in an Italian neighborhood called Howard Beach in Queens, went to a pizzeria to try to call for some help. Young Italian hoods, that blacks and Italians, it's like, do the right thing. There's a sort of love-hate
Yeah.
relationship. There was a hate that night, and they chased the guy out. I was playing on the street in Harlem 2 weeks after that happened, and I write about what it felt like to be out there. Nobody held it against me, but I did find later on, much later, I found out that there were some like Nation of Islam guys who, I found out from a guy who knew them and hung out with them, a black journalist. He said, "Man, those guys knew you were out there and they didn't like it." He goes, "Frankly, I'm surprised one of them didn't take you out." It's like, okay. So I was aware that the politics in Harlem changed. If there was some racial violence against black people somewhere in the city, I was aware when Yusef Hawkins was killed in '89, same summer that Do the Right Thing came out. Yusef Hawkins was shot. He was a teenager in Bensonhurst, very famous. A couple of Italian guys came up to him, one shot him in the heart. They thought he was dating an Italian girl, and he wasn't. He was there to look at a car. He was just a black guy in the wrong neighborhood. So and after that happened, I stayed away from Harlem for 2 weeks because everybody was so pissed off, and I felt it. I was like, I don't want to be around people and upset them,
Yeah.
Anyway, long answer again to a great question. We're
Yeah.
thinking about.
So, I mean, I think in closing this out, I think that, you call for a lot of nuance. You call for like having an open mind and being curious and not just devolving into these overly simplistic narratives. Really, and I think that it's really common that both sides do that. I'm a student and huge fan, I guess, of Jonathan Haidt. I worked with him a little bit at Heterodox Academy, and just like
Yeah, me too.
understanding how people are differently modeled, understanding the value of viewpoint diversity, of having conversations, of wrestling with it, and not just going to, well, here's what it is, that's it, I'm closed off to it, but like wrestling with the nuance of the Trayvon Martin case, the George Floyd case, like all of this stuff, and realizing that, like, have some intellectual humility. Like, I have something to learn from this, and the more that we can call on people to have some intellectual humility, and then some genuine curiosity of like, what am I missing from this? And then some grace. So when you screw up, you talked about your struggle session, like when you screw up, just like extending some courteous goodwill even if they don't understand it, even if they don't deserve it, I should say. And having more conversations and nuanced conversations is really what I'm all about. It's what I'm working to bring to the K through 12
Good.
world, what I'm working to bring through the culture wars in general. And I think that you seem to be really on board with this. That's the, what a
Absolutely.
lot of your work is and everything like that. I think it's really, really important. Book sounds amazing. I think that there's a using something very specific to make it into something more broad for everyone. I think that's what great art does. I think a lot of art is something very personal that makes it universal. And it sounds like
If I can
that's
give you a short kind of super short outro, I'll
yeah.
just say that the phrase beloved community, which is a phrase that John Lewis used at the end of his life, that Martin Luther King certainly used when he says the whole idea of the civil rights movement is true integration, not just desegregation, but true living together, right? Kind of brotherhood and sisterhood in a profound way. In my book, I'm trying to bring that concept alive. I'm trying to say they had something right. They'd figured something out in the early 60s, that the early version of SNCC. There was a kind of brotherhood and sisterhood that really thought we can find another way to live. Baldwin would have said, we must find another way to live, James Baldwin, or, we'll die. And my argument is basically the relatively conscious race mixers who are trying to actually live the American dream and just um, really live that. I'm trying to basically say let's take another look at that concept and let's not go in the direction of hyper racialization. Let's back away from that and think about individuals, and love is one place. So my hope is that people will read the story and go, that's a real love story. And the proof of it is that 20 years later they're still together, they're still having fun. Louis
Yeah.
Armstrong said, in his marriage, like, we're still wailing, older couple, we're still having fun, still having a conversation, and have those nuanced conversations, whether they're in our kind of relationships or marriages or not. But yeah, thank you for holding down the space where we can actually just speak freely and in good faith. Sometimes
Yeah,
speaking
man.
freely just means I get to be abrasive, right? Or just vent, but
Yeah, yeah, and
actually
be
working
free of
things through.
judgment. And
Yeah,
that's so important. That's what I do with Paradox, my online education platform for serving homeschool families and families that their child isn't gay. Some are in traditional classrooms and they just don't get that kind of stuff. So they can work with me and I can be like that intellectual. I work with people one on one too. Just be that like intellectual sparring partner so they can feel like, oh, can I talk about this? Like, yeah, let's talk about it and let's wrestle with the nuance. And that's all the stuff
it's
that I'm
great.
doing
I
with
love it.
Paradox. That's really
Yeah,
awesome.
thanks, Will.
So where can people get your book and like keep up with you? Do you have social media? Like where can people kind of
I
follow your work
do.
and
I
connect?
do. So they can certainly get the book at any of the obvious points. It's on Emancipation Books, which is a sort of actually publishes mostly a handful of sort of black conservatives, but I'm their token white liberal. It's on Post Hill Press, but you can go to Amazon and find it. It's distributed by Simon and Schuster, so it's available on all of those obvious places. I have a If you were to Google put my name in YouTube, put Adam Gussow harmonica, you'd find lots and lots and lots and lots of blues harmonica instructional
Oh,
videos
very
and
cool.
performance videos. I'm in a blues trio called Sir Rod and the Blues Doctors. We play around from time to time. That's sort of where to find me. I have a very small non-blue check Twitter presence or X presence and Blue Sky. So I'm sort of on both of those, but YouTube, you can find a lot of me on YouTube.
Very
So
cool. Well, it was great to connect with you. I really love what you're doing, and I feel very connected. That we're kind of shoulder to shoulder fighting a similar fight. So,
yes,
really appreciate you, man. Thanks for
thanks,
being
Will.
on, and thank you guys all for listening.
My pleasure.